What if one of America's closest allies suddenly threatened to cut off electricity to major US cities in response to new tariffs? That's exactly the high-stakes drama unfolding right now in 2025, as Canada considers halting electricity exports to the US in a bold act of economic retaliation. In this video, we're breaking down this escalating trade showdown, its potential fallout, and what it means for both countries. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to our channel so we can keep bringing you in-depth analysis on the biggest global stories. Now let's get started. In a bold and unprecedented move, Ontario Premier Doug Ford says he's willing to do the unthinkable, completely halt electricity exports to several US states, in direct retaliation for President Donald Trump's latest tariffs on Canadian goods. If that sounds extreme, well, it is. But it's 2025, and if there's one thing we've learned over the past few years, it's that when the Trump administration wants to protect American industry, it often means tariffs, high tariffs, on allies and rivals alike. Here's how we got here. In early March 2025, President Trump announced a 25% tariff on Canadian exports across multiple sectors and a 10% levy on energy imports from Canada. These measures specifically target industries like steel, automobile manufacturing, and even consumer products. For Americans, that likely means higher prices on everyday items. For Canadians, it's a direct shot at the heart of their economy. Ontario, home to nearly 15 million people and the industrial powerhouse of Canada, feels especially threatened. Factories in cities like Windsor, Oshawa, and Toronto are bracing for impact. And as the government in Ontario sees it, a forceful response might be the only way to bring the US to the negotiating table. During a heated press conference, Premier Doug Ford dropped this bombshell. If President Trump goes forward with the tariffs, Ontario might sever electricity exports to neighboring states like New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, all of which rely heavily on Canadian power. Ford didn't mince words. He stated, "If they want to try to annihilate Ontario, I will do anything, including cutting off their energy with a smile on my face." That's not all. Reports suggest Ontario is exploring other offensive measures, including adding a surcharge on every exported megawatt sold to the US, effectively raising electricity costs for American consumers. The province is also considering pulling American alcohol off Liquor Control Board of Ontario, LCBO shelves, an unprecedented form of protest targeting some iconic US brands. Additionally, Ontario may terminate its $100 million deal with Elon Musk's Starlink for rural broadband expansion. These are bold moves, and they underscore how serious this dispute could become. Before diving into Ontario's threat, let's zoom out. Why is Canada so crucial to US energy? In 2024, the US imported 6.1 million barrels of crude oil daily, with over 4 million, nearly 67%, coming from Canada. Canada also supplied 7.4 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day, a key fuel for heating and industry. Electricity imports totaled 38.92 terawatt-hours, with 95% from Canada. Even nuclear energy depends on Canada, which supplied 10 million pounds of uranium to the US. In dollars, this energy trade is worth tens of billions annually, making Canada a cornerstone of US energy security. So when Ontario threatens to cut supply, Washington takes notice. Ontario generates power from nuclear, hydro, natural gas, and renewables, exporting 14 to 20 terawatt-hours annually to US states based on demand and pricing. In 2024, these exports brought in $1.85 billion US dollars, helping offset Ontario's energy costs. But if Ontario withholds supply or imposes surcharges, it's more than an economic issue. It's a political headache for US leaders dealing with higher bills and potential shortages. All of this is happening because President Trump's administration says these tariffs will protect American jobs. It's part of the revived America First rhetoric that's been ramping up again since Trump won re-election in 2024. The White House specifically cited what it calls unfair trade practices by Canada, alleging that Canada's government subsidizes key industries to the detriment of US firms. But critics, and there are many, say these measures do more harm than good. In 2023, the US Chamber of Commerce estimated that tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum alone cost American consumers $1.2 billion. With the new wave of tariffs covering automotive parts, energy imports, and consumer goods, those costs could skyrocket. Canada has been actively pursuing a diversification strategy to reduce its reliance on the US market, particularly in the energy sector. In 2024, the long-awaited Trans Mountain Expansion (TMX) pipeline became operational, providing a more efficient route for Alberta's oil sands to reach the Pacific coast. This development has opened new export opportunities in Asia, with China, Japan, and South Korea emerging as key buyers. Canadian crude exports to China surged from nearly zero to over $1.8 billion in the first 11 months of 2024. Meanwhile, Japan has also become a focal point for Canadian energy exports. In February 2025, Alberta's Minister of Environment and Protected Areas, Rebecca Schultz, reinforced the province's commitment to increasing shipments of natural gas and crude to Japan. While losing the US market would still be a major blow, Canada's strategic shift makes it less vulnerable to potential trade conflicts. Ottawa's push to secure new buyers overseas signals a clear effort to reduce American leverage over its energy sector. The economic fallout from this trade war won't just affect politicians. It will hit millions of everyday people and businesses on both sides of the border. If Ontario follows through on its threat to cut electricity exports, states like New York, Michigan, and Minnesota will feel the effects immediately. These regions rely heavily on Canadian power to stabilize their grids, especially in extreme weather. A sudden halt could lead to higher electricity bills as utilities scramble for alternative sources, rolling blackouts during peak seasons, and manufacturing slowdowns that force factories to cut shifts or lay off workers. At the same time, Trump's tariffs on Canadian goods would drive up prices on cars, appliances, and steel-based products. With import costs passed down to consumers, groceries and everyday essentials could become more expensive, adding to inflationary pressures already squeezing American households. While Ontario's electricity cutoff is a bold move, it comes at a cost. The province earns significant revenue from energy exports, and blocking that income could lead to budget shortfalls, putting pressure on healthcare, education, and social services. Meanwhile, Canada's manufacturing sector, particularly auto parts suppliers, is bracing for impact. If the 25% tariff remains in place, industry experts warn that up to 160,000 Canadian jobs could be at risk, dealing a serious blow to the economy. Washington is unlikely to sit back and accept such a drastic move. The White House could retaliate by imposing even harsher tariffs on Canada, escalating tensions further. If the standoff continues, it could put the entire United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, at risk, threatening decades of economic cooperation and disrupting supply chains across North America. This isn't just a trade dispute anymore. It's an energy crisis and an economic battle with real consequences for businesses and households. If neither side backs down, millions of people could feel the pain. The real question is, who will blink first? It's important to remember that while the United States is an energy powerhouse, it remains deeply dependent on global supply chains. The country imports vast amounts of raw materials, including rare earth minerals essential for tech and defense industries. It also relies on specialty products like steel alloys that many American mills don't produce domestically. Beyond materials, talent is another key import. Thousands of Canadian professionals work in the US in sectors like tech, finance, and healthcare. When these links are disrupted, the ripple effects can be enormous. Picture major automakers in Detroit or Lansing dealing with multiple crises at once. Canadian steel becomes more expensive. Overseas parts shipments face delays, and energy bills spike due to strained electricity imports. The result? Production slowdowns, potential layoffs, and growing frustration from both workers and businesses. The political consequences could be just as significant. Any leader perceived as mishandling the situation, whether in Washington or Ottawa, could face serious backlash. As economic pressures mount, what starts as a trade dispute could quickly spiral into a broader crisis, with real consequences for industries, jobs, and everyday consumers on both sides of the border. The trade crisis isn't just about tariffs and energy. It's exposing a deep divide in Canada's leadership. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has taken a hardline stance, openly declaring that he will do whatever it takes to fight back, even if it means cutting off electricity to the US. His rhetoric has been aggressive, rallying support from industries and workers who fear economic collapse. For many in Ontario, Ford's tough stance represents a necessary defense against what they see as an unfair attack on their economy. But Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is taking a different approach. While acknowledging the severity of Trump's tariffs, he's pushing for a more measured diplomatic response. Instead of drastic moves like halting energy exports, Trudeau has vowed to implement dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs, mirroring the U.S. penalties while still keeping trade open. His goal is to de-escalate the situation and keep negotiations on the table. Despite Trudeau's attempts at diplomacy, political pressure is mounting. Opposition leader Pierre Poilievre has taken an even tougher stance than Ford, arguing that Canada must retaliate forcefully or risk becoming a pushover in future trade disputes. Across party lines, there's a growing consensus that Canada cannot afford to back down. Meanwhile, the U.S. response remains unpredictable. If Ontario follows through with its electricity threat, Washington could retaliate by slapping even higher tariffs on key Canadian exports or taking other drastic economic measures. Some analysts warn that this could spiral into an all-out trade war, putting the entire United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, at risk. Others believe cooler heads will prevail and that both sides will eventually seek a resolution. But taking a hardline stance comes with real consequences. While Premier Ford is willing to play hardball, the question remains: can Canada actually afford to follow through on these threats? Cutting off electricity exports may seem like a powerful bargaining chip, but it also carries serious risks for Ontario's own economy. If the province moves forward with this drastic measure, it won't just be the U.S. feeling the pressure. Canada could face economic repercussions of its own. Shutting off electricity exports isn't a decision Canada, or Ontario, could take lightly. The revenue from these exports plays a crucial role in keeping local utility rates stable. Without it, Ontario could face higher electricity costs, adding strain to households and businesses alike. Then there's oil. In 2024 alone, Canada exported an estimated $16.8 billion worth of crude to the U.S., with Alberta's economy deeply reliant on energy exports. If trade tensions escalate and Washington retaliates with broader bans or higher tariffs, Canada could lose billions in revenue, hitting not just Alberta but the national economy as well. This raises the big question: can Canada afford to take such a drastic step, even temporarily? Premier Doug Ford is betting that the sheer shock of an electricity cutoff would force the White House to rethink its stance. But if the gamble doesn't pay off, the economic fallout could hit both sides of the border, leaving Canada to weigh whether the move is truly worth the cost. Could the U.S. and Canada pull back from the brink before this trade dispute spirals out of control, figuratively or even literally? Some experts believe a fast-tracked series of bilateral talks could de-escalate tensions, while others argue that only direct intervention from President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau can truly break the deadlock. In practical terms, both sides might be willing to offer partial concessions. The U.S. could agree to reduce or temporarily suspend the 10% energy tariff, at least for certain provinces or specific products. In return, Canada might hold off on blocking electricity exports or imposing retaliatory surcharges, keeping trade flows relatively stable. The real question is whether political leaders are more interested in avoiding economic turmoil or if they see strategic value in fueling nationalist sentiment. Recent history suggests that trade and politics are deeply intertwined, and that once tensions escalate, predicting the outcome becomes nearly impossible. The stakes are sky high and the clock is ticking. Are we on the brink of a full-blown trade standoff between Canada and the US? Or will cooler heads find a way to make a deal? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to stay one step ahead of every twist in this unfolding story.